This is where we really get under the skin of complex institutions, look beyond those daily headlines, and try to figure out the structural truths driving how they actually work. Today, we are pushing past the usual discussions, the common accusations about simple political bias. We're looking at something deeper, a really profound institutional condition.
Yeah, something almost psychological within the organization itself.
Exactly. And our mission today, it's pretty challenging, quite ambitious, actually. It requires us to bring in some serious sociological thinking. We're putting forward a specific argument that the internal culture of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, has, over many decades, it's sort of mutated.
Mutated how?
Into what we are calling a full-blown cult of institutional righteousness.
Okay, wow. That's a deliberately provocative phrase, isn't it? A cult of institutional righteousness. We need to define that straight away for you listening. This isn't just saying they're, arrogant sometimes or they make mistakes now and then. No, this is about an organizational state, a state where self-preservation, basically keeping up that spotless reputation becomes more important, fundamentally more important than the journalistic job of seeking and telling the truth.
Right.
So in this kind of cult, the organization's absolute top moral priority becomes its own survival and making sure it always looks virtuous, completely flawless.
So we're looking at the BBC not just as, a media company or a public broadcaster, but as this really complex psychological entity. We have to dig into the evidence from our sources, structural evidence, sociological theory, behavior patterns, to really show that this comparison, this idea of a cult, actually makes sense sociologically.
It's about demonstrating that the BBC's #1 internal goal is protecting its own sacred story, its own myth.
Even if that means sacrificing its original mission sometimes.
Exactly. If we can demonstrate that the organization's main function has become defending its own image rather than, say, critically looking at its performance and learning from it, then the analogy, that holds water.
So we need to look at how they react when challenged.
Yes. How they react to criticism, what structures allow this defensiveness to thrive, and crucially, how they treat anyone who disagrees, inside or out.
Okay, that's where we start then. Let's get straight into that reaction. How does this institution respond when it faces a fundamental challenge? Let's dive into section 1. The cult's immune response, denial, and defensive routines.
Right. So the basic idea here is that institutions, especially powerful ones, when they face truths that feel threatening, they develop these psychological defense mechanisms, almost like an immune system.
Okay, an immune response.
In the BBC's case, the argument is that it ends up sacrificing real accountability, genuine learning, to preserve this myth it has about its own impartiality.
And that reflex, that defensive reaction.
That's a classic symptom, a really definitive sign of serious institutional problems, and it actually mirrors patterns you see in cult dynamics.
And there's an academic framework that helps us understand this failure to learn, isn't there? Chris Argyris and his concept of organizational defensive routines.
Yes, Argyris. It's a really critical concept. If you want to understand why big, powerful organizations, even ones full of incredibly smart people, often just fail to change, fail to reform.
So what are these routines exactly?
Well, Argyris saw that powerful groups often create these specific ways of behaving, these routines, specifically designed to stop their members, especially the leadership, from feeling, embarrassed or threatened.
Like an institutional flinch reaction, protecting themselves.
Exactly. It's institutional self-protection. The internal aim is to dodge shame, avoid any confrontation that might expose, deeper flaws in the system.
But here's the catch, right? The really painful paradox, as Argyris pointed out. While these routines work really well at keeping things comfortable inside, saving face for the bosses, they actually stop the organization from seeing, let alone fixing, the real causes of the problem in the first place.
Precisely. They create this insulated bubble. Self-esteem inside the bubble is protected, sure, but organizational learning just dies. It can't happen.
Why not? Why is admitting the root cause so hard?
Because if the organization admits the problem is systemic, like a fundamental flaw in the culture or the structure itself, then everyone involved in upholding that culture, they're implicated, aren't they?
Okay. It becomes an existential threat to the people in charge.
Totally. It's much, much safer internally to just reframe the problem, make it seem like an isolated thing, a random human error, something manageable that doesn't reflect on the whole system.
And that's when this internal shielding, this defense routine goes public, right?
Yes. It shapes the official statements.
And the sources we looked at, they give us probably the most striking, the most definitive example of this exact routine playing out in public.
Oh, you mean the quote from the outgoing CEO?
Exactly. After a major editorial scandal, it's that moment where the institutional defense mechanism is just spoken out loud with this weird kind of solemnity.
Yes, I remember. The statement was so stark, so simple, and from an analytical perspective, completely self-defeating. It was. There is no institutional bias. Mistakes are made, but there's no institutional bias.
That line, it gets repeated a lot in the source material.
And it's just a masterclass in rhetorical deflection. It instantly just trashes the value of genuine truth, of real accountability.
Okay, let's break that down. Why is that specific quote such perfect evidence of an organizational defensive routine? What's going on there?
Well, first, you've got the tactical admission, right? Mistakes are made.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
The ritual apology bit.
Exactly. They acknowledge something went wrong, a bad headline, a clumsy edit, maybe one person being careless. It's like a small sacrifice to the public, showing they noticed a blip.
So that's the surface level, designed to calm things down.
Right. But then, immediately after that tiny concession, you get the institutional hardline, the absolute brick wall. But there's no institutional bias.
Oh. So they separate the mistake from the culture?
Completely. They're basically saying, look, we had a few random, unconnected accidents, little tactical errors, but we fiercely deny any systemic failure. The culture itself is fine.
And admitting a systemic failure, that's the dangerous part for them.
Because that demands wholesale cultural change, doesn't it? It implies the whole leadership might have overseen a flawed system.
Whereas admitting an individual mistake,
that's easy. That's manageable. You just need, I don't know, a minor sanction, maybe some retraining for one person. It protects the leadership cohort from having to accept that maybe the shared norms, the whole culture they're responsible for, might be fundamentally flawed structurally or ideologically.
it really is the ultimate form of face-saving, isn't it?
Absolutely. If there's no institutional bias, then there's nothing fundamental that needs fixing in the structure or the culture. The deep problem, the potential cultural pathology, just gets waved away as a minor administrative glitch.
It's like diagnosing cancer but only treating the pain while loudly denying the cancer even exists.
That's a good analogy. And the consequence of this reflexive defending.
Well, the public starts to see those promises of lessons learned and future reform as basically worthless, right?
Can you trust them? How can the public possibly trust a promise to improve if the organization refuses point blank to even acknowledge the real nature, the systemic cause of its past failures? It makes no sense.
And this leads straight to that perception, which is documented in our sources, that the institution genuinely believes it is, and I quote, too vital and too virtuous to fail.
That belief, that profound sense of its own importance, its irreplaceability in public life, that's the psychological fuel for this cult dynamic we're talking about.
The organization has managed to convince itself that its survival isn't just, convenient for those working there, but it's actually synonymous with the good of the nation itself.
And if you truly believe you're too vital to fail,
then your tolerance for error goes way up. You develop this kind of structural immunity to criticism from the outside.
because in your internal story, the critics aren't offering helpful feedback. No, they're trying to destroy something sacred, something essential to the country.
And that's structural immunity.
Yeah.
That's what we need to dig into next. Where does it come from? Okay, so we sort of mapped out the psychological, how that deep defensiveness Argyris talked about. Now we need to shift to the foundations, the structural elements that give this pathology the room, the immunity. It needs to really take root and flourish.
Right. This is where we look at the concrete things, money and history, essentially.
Finance and myth.
Yeah. To keep a cult of institutional righteousness going, you need, a protective barrier, an insulating layer that shields the organization from real-world consequences.
And for almost every other media organization on the planet.
The market provides that discipline, doesn't it? If you fail your audience, if your credibility tanks, people just stop buying, stop subscribing, stop watching. Your funding dries up.
But the BBC, it operates outside that crucial feedback loop, that market discipline.
It does. And the sources are absolutely clear on this. The compulsory license fee is identified as the ultimate structural mechanism that enables this kind of cult structure. This guaranteed river of funding is what disconnects the organization from genuine, potentially existential accountability.
That's a really critical point, isn't it? The license fee removes that fundamental tool of the free market.
Which is the power of the customer, the audience member, to punish failure by simply taking their money elsewhere.
Right. So you, listening right now, you might absolutely despise the BBC's current direction. Maybe you deeply distrust its editorial choices. Maybe you never watch or listen to its news.
But if you own a television that can receive live broadcasts or use the iPlayer,
The law basically mandates your continued financial support. And arguably moral support, too.
so how does that guaranteed money translate into this internal psychological immunity we talked about?
Well, imagine you're a top executive at, say, a commercial media company. Every big failure, a huge drop in ratings, a major scandal, it immediately hits the bottom line. It threatens profits, bonuses, maybe even the company's long-term survival.
That financial threat forces you to self-correct, doesn't it? You have to respond.
But for the BBC, that immediate financial threat is significantly dampened, maybe even totally removed in the short to medium term.
And this lack of a direct financial feedback loop, it feeds straight into one of the key symptoms of Irving Janis's groupthink model,
Which is,
the illusion of invulnerability.
okay, let's unpack the psychology there. Why would the internal culture, that elite echo chamber we mentioned, bother going through the painful process of self-reflection and real structural change?
Why open yourselves up to difficult, threatening truths?
If your core funding is basically guaranteed by law, no matter how well or poorly you perform, no matter if public trust collapses, then doesn't the institution start to believe deep down that it's immune to the ultimate consequence? That it can't really fail?
Exactly. The underlying message is incredibly powerful. Okay, we might take some hits to our reputation, we might get bad headlines, but we won't suffer a catastrophic collapse like a commercial rival might.
And the structural immunity just solidifies the internal belief that, well, whatever we're doing, it must be fundamentally correct enough or virtuous enough or just plain essential enough that the system itself protects us from failing.
It makes it so much easier to just dismiss criticism as, background noise, rather than seeing it as a legitimate threat that requires real change.
But hang on, isn't the whole point of the license fee structure, historically at least, meant to be the opposite? To protect the BBC's independence from political and commercial pressures, allowing it to do high-quality, maybe sometimes unpopular public service stuff.
Ah, yes, the paradox of structural privilege.
How do we argue that this mechanism, which was intended for good, has actually become the enabler for this cult of righteousness?
Well, the intention was absolutely noble independence from the whims of the market and politicians, but when you combine that financial insulation with those organizational defensive routines we discussed earlier, the noble idea starts to curdle.
How so?
The guarantee of funding means critics can't actually hurt the bottom line in the way they could with a commercial entity. So their criticism can be easily reframed internally. It's not seen as valid feedback demanding reform.
It's seen as malice, or,
as we'll get to, as heresy. It effectively turns independence into a kind of entitlement, a shield against accountability, rather than a foundation for brave journalism.
okay, so the financial structure is one massive pillar enabling this. But you said it's only half the story.
Right. The other half, and maybe it's even more powerful in some ways, is the intangible stuff, the weight of history, tradition, the founding narrative.
The weaponization of the founding myth, the original Rethian values.
Exactly. The BBC's founding mission, inform, educate, and entertain, it's undeniably hugely significant historically. But the argument is, within this cult of righteousness, that history stops being a guiding principle you can actually evaluate critically.
It becomes
like a sacred text. Unquestionable, untouchable, pure. It functions like the founding scripture for a religious group.
And this sacred text gets used defensively.
Massively. It's deployed as this incredibly powerful rhetorical shield. So when critics point to a specific, current, demonstrable failure, like, say, really poor handling of a sensitive internal complaint, or those documented breaches of editorial standards, like splicing a president's speech,
What's the institutional response?
the defense is almost always to immediately elevate the argument, to change the terms of the debate.
How?
They pull a specific rhetorical move, they shift the goalposts instantly. The defense becomes, look, you're not really criticizing the specific mistake we made. What you're actually doing is attacking the entire ideal of public service broadcasting itself.
Wow, that's quite a leap.
It's institutional sleight of hand. They move the whole conversation away from a verifiable fact, like, did you or did you not breach your own standards here, to this grand, abstract, unverifiable moral question. Do you support the very idea of public service?
And by framing a specific, factual critique as this huge existential threat to a cherished national ideal.
They effectively shut down any reasonable debate, don't they? And they simultaneously reinforce the inherent righteousness of the institution. If you dare to critique the BBC as it currently operates, you're implicitly attacking the great Lord Reth himself and the very notion of broadcasting for the public good.
It becomes an attack on virtue itself.
It's classic myth-making, and it's designed purely to enforce ideological conformity and just end the conversation. It weaponizes the BBC's undeniable, immense legacy against its specific current failure.
And if the myth is sacred,
then those who criticize it must be profane. You can't argue against the sacred text without being branded a heretic, which naturally leads us right into validating this whole argument with some proper sociological theory.
Okay, so we need to move beyond just describing the behavior and really ground this whole thesis in established academic thinking. If the way the BBC behaves internally matches known patterns of institutional dysfunction, patterns seen in cult dynamics, then this whole cult analogy isn't just rhetoric, it actually holds academic weight.
Exactly. We need to show the theory supports the observation. And a good place to start is defining the engine that really drives this internal culture. That's where Irving Janis's theory of groupthink comes in. It perfectly describes that elite echo chamber we mentioned operating at the core of the BBC.
Right, groupthink. Remind us what that is.
Janis describes situations where groups, especially ones that are really close-knit, very insulated from the outside and making big decisions, they start to prioritize sticking together, maintaining harmony, and believing in themselves, overthinking critically or accurately, assessing reality.
And if you're hiring and promoting almost entirely from within a very narrow, culturally similar pool, which the sources suggest happens at the BBC, you create the perfect conditions for this, right?
Absolutely. You get an environment where the desire to keep the group happy and cohesive just completely outweighs the desire or even the ability to challenge the dominant view.
And our sources point to specific symptoms of groupthink being really common within the BBC structure.
Yes, two main ones stand out. First, we already touched on it, the illusion of invulnerability. That powerful self-belief system that says, essentially, we have a righteous mission, our funding is guaranteed by law, therefore we are fundamentally correct and we basically cannot fail. That structural guarantee of the license fee directly feeds this feeling of invulnerability.
Okay, invulnerability is one. What's the second key symptom?
The second one is maybe even more damaging, particularly for a journalistic organization. It's the role of what Janis called mind guards.
Mind guards. Sounds ominous.
They are senior figures inside the group whose job, whether they consciously realize it or not, is basically to shield the leadership, the core in-group, from hearing negative criticism from outside or even uncomfortable dissent from within their own ranks.
Ah, so they act like filters.
Exactly. Mind guards are crucial for maintaining the cult atmosphere. They filter internal reports upwards. They might slow down investigations that could be embarrassing. They make sure that the leadership's preferred view of the world, their institutional self-belief, isn't challenged by awkward facts or dissenting opinions.
They're the gatekeepers, keeping the echo chamber pure, making sure the leadership only hears confirming information.
Precisely. And this constant filtering, this management of information flow, leads to a really profound shift internally, a shift in where loyalty lies.
Okay.
And this brings us to a slightly more complex idea, but it's key to understanding why someone, say, a senior journalist or manager, might end up prioritizing the institution over journalistic truth. It's DiMaggio and Powell's theory of organizational isomorphism, specifically the normative kind.
Isomorphism.
Yeah.
Meaning organizations becoming similar.
Yeah, the theory generally explains why organizations in the same field, like hospitals or universities, tend to look and act alike over time. But the normative part is crucial for the BBC because the BBC defines itself so strongly by its professional norms and values.
So what does normative isomorphism suggest here?
It suggests that organizations adopt certain practices not necessarily because they're the most efficient or because the market demands them, but because they are seen as morally or professionally appropriate within that specific professional group or field.
Okay, so how does that apply to the BBC's internal culture?
In the BBC context, the argument is that this leads to journalistic independence, that core value being gradually replaced by something else, by what you could call a kind of priestly vow.
A priestly vow.
An unwritten but incredibly powerful vow of allegiance to the institution itself. The highest moral standard for the management class subtly shifts. It stops being about upholding the BBC Charter's commitment to truth and impartiality above all else.
And
It becomes about upholding the institution's own need for self-preservation and protecting its reputation at all costs. That becomes the new highest good.
the loyalty shifts from the principle to the organization.
Completely. And you see this demonstrated in actual behavior. Internal practices like how they handle external complaints, or the tendency to promote people who've shown unwavering loyalty to the institution, maybe even defended it against criticism. These practices become dictated by institutional self-interest, even when they clearly clash with the spirit, maybe even the letter, of the BBC's own charter.
And we see actual examples of this in the source material, right, where this institutional guardianship seems to just override basic journalism.
Absolutely. The sources describe management acting as institutional guardians first and journalists second. Think about the initial response to that major editorial controversy involving the splicing of a U.S. president's speech.
What was the initial reaction?
The first, almost knee-jerk reaction from management wasn't, okay, let's investigate quickly and find out the facts. No. It was, according to the sources, to actively refuse to accept there had been a breach of standards.
Wow. Just deny it outright.
Think about the psychology behind that initial refusal. Admitting the breach straight away would mean admitting a systemic failure happened on their watch. That risks damaging the righteous reputation of the whole organization.
So it's much easier, much safer for the leadership group.
To just deny the breach happened, even if the evidence was pretty clear, because that institutional self-allegiance, that priestly vow, kicks in and trumps the editorial commitment to owning up to the truth. The defensive routine activates instantly.
And we see a similar pattern, don't we, when looking at those serious concerns about systemic anti-Israel bias within BBC Arabic, including, apparently, platforming contributors with extremist views.
Yes. The evidence laid out in the sources suggests that internal warnings, people raising red flags about these really critical, high-stakes editorial problems, were often just ignored or downplayed, or the process for dealing with them was painfully slow-walked by senior management.
That failure to act quickly, that's the mind guards in action again.
It fits the pattern perfectly. If dealing with the controversy quickly and transparently risks creating a big public scandal, one that might prove the critics right and damage the organization's carefully crafted image of righteousness, then the mind guards step in. The process stalls.
So the priority isn't upholding rigorous editorial standards.
No. The priority becomes avoiding a public relations disaster that would tarnish the corporate brand. And sacrificing transparency, maybe even sacrificing editorial integrity to protect the image, that just confirms the underlying organizational dogma. The institution itself is the most important story, and keeping it going, even at the cost of full honesty, is the highest moral imperative.
Okay, so to wrap up this sociological validation bit, let's quickly link all this back to the broader idea of cultism itself, maybe using Arthur Dykman's framework.
Yeah, Dykman's work is really useful here. He studied cults and argued that many cult dynamics like intense dependence on a leader, pressure for group conformity, aggressively devaluing outsiders aren't necessarily bizarre aberrations. They're often just extreme versions of normal human psychological needs and anxieties operating within a closed group.
So how did the BBC's cultural traits line up with Dykman's observations on cult dynamics?
Well, first, the culture shows intense dependence, not necessarily on one single charismatic human leader, like in some cults, on the myth of the institution itself. The BBC brand, its history, its Rethian ideals, that acts as the central, sacred entity that dictates morality and purpose for the insiders.
Okay, dependence on the myth. What else?
Second, you see active avoidance of dissent. That's the groupthink we talked about. And the mind guards actively filtering out challenging information to maintain that ideological purity inside the bubble.
Right. Dependence, avoidance of dissent, and the third.
And third, the devaluation of outsiders. Critics aren't just seen as people with a different opinion or even political opponents. They get framed as heretics, as people actively trying to destroy the sacred order.
So by applying these established theories, Argyris, Janis, DiMaggio and Powell, Dykman, we can argue that the BBC's highly defensive, internally focused structure isn't just behaving like a flawed corporation.
It's functioning, sociologically speaking, much more like a secular self-referential cult. Its institutional narcissism isn't just an accident. It's a predictable outcome of its structure and the psychological dynamics at play.
Okay, so if you're running this cult of institutional righteousness, you absolutely need a way to deal with anyone who dares challenge your sacred beliefs, your core myths.
You have to. You need mechanisms to identify and essentially neutralize the heretics, both the ones outside the walls and, crucially, any that might pop up inside.
So the cult structure, it demands that you push blame outwards and crush any dissent internally, just to keep that sense of righteous self-belief intact.
Absolutely. It's fundamental to maintaining the illusion. Let's look at the external threat first. How does the institution frame its critics? To understand this, we need to bring in social identity theory, SIT, developed by Tajfel and Turner.
SIT. Okay, how does that help explain the BBC's relationship with its critics?
SIT is really useful here because it helps explain why the debate around the BBC often becomes so incredibly polarized, so us versus them. The core idea of the theory is that people get a big chunk of their self-esteem, their sense of identity, from the groups they belong to, their in-group.
Right, we identify with our tribe.
And to feel good about our tribe, and therefore ourselves, we instinctively strive to make our in-group look good, often by comparing it favorably to other groups, the out-groups. We want positive distinctiveness for our group.
Okay, so how does that play out with the BBC?
Well, this drive for positive distinctiveness naturally leads to something called out-group derogation. That's the tendency to view rival groups, competitors, or in this case critics, in a negative light. Often, we distort their motives to make our own group look better by comparison.
So for the BBC elite, their identity is deeply tied up in this myth of the righteous public broadcaster.
Exactly. So when they get challenged, the argument almost instantly stops being a rational disagreement about facts or standards. It morphs into a moral battle. The BBC implicitly defines itself as good by contrasting itself with its supposedly bad critics.
And the language used to describe these critics becomes really important then.
Hugely revealing. The sources detail how critics are pretty much immediately cast not just as people with disagreements, but as enemies. They're routinely dismissed as being politically motivated.
Even stronger terms are used, right?
Oh, yes. Specifically, the sources mention critics being labeled as part of an organized coup or mounting a coordinated, politically motivated attack.
Framing it as a coup or a coordinated attack, that's quite something.
It's an indispensable rhetorical tactic for the cult structure. Because if the criticism isn't genuine feedback, but is actually driven by a malicious, hidden political agenda, an attempted coup, then you don't have to engage with the substance of their complaint at all, do you?
No. Why would you? You don't negotiate with people trying to stage a coup.
Exactly. You just defend the sacred mission against them. End of discussion.
So this creates this really stark, simplistic worldview inside the institution, inside that priesthood, as we've called it.
It has to. It creates a necessary binary.
Yeah.
On one side, there's usus, the righteous mission, the believers. On the other side, there's them, the malicious outsiders, the heretics.
So the intense polarization we often see around the BBC isn't just some unfortunate side effect of, say, modern media or politics.
No, the argument is that it's actually a necessary feature of this institutional culture. It allows the insiders to completely avoid challenging their own core beliefs by simply externalizing all the blame. If we, the institution, are fundamentally good and virtuous, then anyone who criticizes us must be fundamentally malicious or misguided.
Okay, so that's how they deal with external heretics. What about dissent within the walls?
Right. That institutional narcissism, which is fueled by the groupthink and protected by that structural immunity, it demands absolute conformity inside the organization too.
If you're part of the priesthood.
Then new ideas, different perspectives, dissenting voices, they aren't seen as valuable things that could sharpen the output or challenge assumptions. No, they're seen as threats. Threats to the shared belief system, potential sources of contamination that could weaken the group's cohesion.
And this is how that elite echo chamber we talked about earlier hardens into what you call the isolation chamber.
Precisely. It becomes this self-selecting group that promotes people almost entirely from within its own narrow cultural and ideological mold. If you fully buy into the defensive routines, if you demonstrate that unwavering institutional loyalty, that priestly vow, then your career is likely to flourish.
But if you prioritize independent thinking, journalistic skepticism, maybe challenge the status quo.
Then you become a threat to the internal harmony. You risk being sidelined, managed out, or simply finding your voice isn't heard.
And there's evidence of the human cost of this internal conformity, isn't there? From those independent reviews into the BBC's internal culture.
Yes, absolutely devastating evidence. One review highlighted very clearly that the internal processes for dealing with problems like bullying or harassment consistently failed to properly address a minority of people who behave unacceptably.
And crucially,
Crucially, those people behaving unacceptably were often in positions where power could be abused.
that finding is incredibly important, isn't it? It validates the idea that there's an untouchable, protected class, the core members of the priesthood, whose bad behavior, even potential abuses of power, are effectively allowed to continue without real consequences.
And when more junior staff or anyone outside that protected circle tries to raise concerns, tries to report issues that might threaten this power structure, what happens?
The process itself becomes part of the problem. The source material describes the experience for those reporting issues as feeling traumatized, unsupportive, and overly long.
That slow, grinding, unsupportive process, that's the internal defense mechanism in action, isn't it? The organization instinctively protects the powerful few, the core in-group members, often at the direct expense of the more vulnerable person trying to speak truth to power the junior staffer, the whistleblower.
The fact that there's such a lack of accountability for those in positions where power could be abused shows pretty clearly where the institution's real priorities lie.
It demonstrates unequivocally that the institution values protecting its internal hierarchy, its power structures, and its defensive mechanisms far more than it values its basic duty of care to all its employees, or even upholding basic standards of behavior.
And this internal paralysis, this failure to deal with internal problems, feeds directly back into those editorial failures we discussed earlier.
Yes, it connects right back. Think again about that specific example of the concerns over systemic anti-Israel bias in BBC Arabic, including platforming extremists. The evidence suggested internal warnings were met with bureaucratic inertia. Things just dragged on.
That inertia, that slow walking, it isn't just inefficiency.
It's unlikely to be just inefficiency when it consistently protects the status quo from difficult truths. It looks like the operationalization of that mind guard role again. If senior management acts decisively to fix a major editorial problem like that, they risk creating a public scandal.
A scandal that might prove the external critics were right all along.
And that would directly challenge the organization's precious, righteous self-image. So from an institutional self-preservation perspective, it's actually safer to let the internal process grind slowly, maybe even to a halt. You protect the corporate brand image, even if that means knowingly sacrificing rigorous editorial integrity or failing to address serious bias.
So the ultimate paradox is just complete, isn't it? An institution whose entire public purpose is to inform the nation is itself structurally and psychologically incapable of the kind of critical self-reflection needed to do that job properly.
Yes. The cult of institutional righteousness has become fully operational, trapped in this endless loop of denying problems, protecting itself, and preserving its own myth above all else.
This intellectual conformity, protected by denial, shielded by the license fee, it just leaves the institution kind of stagnant, doesn't it? Insular.
And perpetually guaranteed to repeat the same fundamental mistakes over and over again, all while sincerely, truly believing it's operating at the highest possible moral standard. #tag outro. So to wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to the thesis we started with. The goal was to prove it.
That the BBC operates as a cult of institutional righteousness.
Right. And we've tried to show how multiple frameworks from sociology and psychology Argyris on those defensive routines, Janis on groupthink, DiMaggio and Powell on that normative loyalty shift, social identity theory on how conflict is handled, how all these validate that claim.
We've argued that the BBC's internal culture, deeply defensive, intensely moralistic about itself, fundamentally elitist, is structurally acting like a self-contained, self-referential cult.
And that its single biggest editorial priority has become not the journalistic pursuit of truth, but the constant protection of its own sacred reputation.
So what does all this actually mean? For the organization's future, its relevance.
Well, the core argument is that this self-infatuation, this automatic defense of the cult of righteousness, is probably the single biggest threat to the BBC's own credibility, especially now in this incredibly fragmented, skeptical media world we live in.
So if it wants to recover its standing, recover trust.
It has to find a way to abandon this reflexive defensiveness. It needs to actively, maybe even painfully, dismantle that elite echo chamber, the one that's structurally shielded by the license fee.
And the conclusion mandate, the key takeaway for you listening.
It's absolutely essential. Regaining credibility requires a massive dose of institutional humility. But humility is the very thing those defensive routines are designed to prevent.
So until the BBC can somehow rediscover that skepticism, that self-doubt, which is fundamental to genuine independent journalism.
Then the institution isn't really acting as the nation's conscience. It's acting as its most sophisticated congregation.
Conscience versus congregation. That distinction really hits home. A congregation's first loyalty is always to the institution, to the faith itself.
Whereas a conscience is loyal only to the truth, however uncomfortable.
Okay, so if we accept the argument that the compulsory license fee is the ultimate structural enabler here, the thing that gives the institution that devastating illusion of invulnerability, what kind of structural accountability could possibly work, short of the nuclear option of just removing the fee entirely and throwing the BBC to the market wolves?
Yeah, what kind of structural change could potentially force the institution to break that internal vow of self-allegiance? What could genuinely, structurally enforce humility?
That's the really tough question, isn't it? And that is the thought we want to leave you with today on the Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.